So how does the number 3 team in the country disappoint? That's where the standard is at this point that people are talking about. What's wrong with Georgia? Why are they not blowing teams out? Why did Florida hang around with a backup quarterback? How do you assess this football team at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all, reasonable questions to ask, 10 weeks into the season. They haven't felt like Georgia, but I think, like you said, Georgia is kind of judged through a different lens than some other programs out there. So, yeah, for Georgia, for that standard of, this should be what were they preseason number 1 team in the country, Carson Beck, preseason Heisman favorite and all that. They're 7-1, but it doesn't feel the best 7-1 right now.
Ruby, I will let you and Matt slice and dice the X's and O's, and I'll just kick back and enjoy from here.
One thing that I want to point out when you say that is something that I always think about with Georgia and Alabama in particular is the mark of a good team is when you can finish the games and win the games you're supposed to. And I think that's one thing about Georgia is, yes, they are coming off of a loss to Alabama, but that was a game that they weren't favored to win, and it was tough. And at the time, Alabama looked like the team to beat. And the thing that I'm really looking forward to seeing this week is, can Ole Miss find a way to win this game? Because we saw them lose against Kentucky in a game that they should have beat. They shouldn't lose at home. They're not a team that really does lose at home. Is this one of those situations where which team is going to be able to come out and, finish the fourth quarter? Because I don't think the game's going to be over before that final whistle.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. And I think from a Georgia perspective, every week we get away from that Alabama game, we're just wondering, what team did Georgia play that day? Because we have not seen that Alabama team. Like, what has been 5-6 games in a row now? They've just barely beaten teams, and the offense has not looked good. Like, I had my criticisms of Jalen Milroe coming into the season, and halftime of that Georgia game, I'm like, okay, I was wrong. This is the best player in college football. And then ever since then, we've seen that Alabama offense struggle. So I think one thing that's interesting that I feel like everyone's talking about right now, obviously, is, Carson Beck and his struggles, 11 interceptions in the last 5 games. But one thing I find interesting is, so Carson Beck, he's definitely struggled. Don't get me wrong. Like he has regressed, but in a lot of these games, like you're talking about finishing at the end, like when Texas had all the momentum after the fans are throwing everything on the field and they cut that game to a touchdown, it came down to a 3rd and long on that next possession deep in Georgia territory. And Beck was able to complete that big 3rd down pass to Arian Smith. And then Georgia, I think it was like an 89-yard drive they went on to kind of, exhale and take control of that game. And then you kind of saw a similar thing in the Florida game. Despite his struggles with the 3 interceptions late in the game on that, when the game was 2020, he found his man, Arian Smith, who most Georgia fans didn't think was going to be our number 1 receiver coming in the season, but he really has been that most consistent receiver. So despite Beck's struggles, I think you heard Kirby Smart say at the press conference at the last game, like, we're not going to stop throwing. Like, this team can't really run the ball well, and the passing game has been the strength of the offense. So you're going to kind of go down with the ship of Carson Beck, for lack of a better term.
Absolutely. And that's such a credit to Kirby Smart as well. He's a coach who can get it done. And I think that's where a lot of Ole Miss fans are kind of looking for Kiffin to take that next step of, yes, he can get to 10 wins. Yes, he, is a great offensive mind, but can he get to the point where he wins those big games that are tough or aren't going his way and finish them out? So it'll be a good one.
Okay, now I am truly surrounded by football knowledge on all sides. So great to have Leanne here. As always, Leanne Herring and I have co-hosted this show, let's see, for 9 weeks now. So Leanne's been here. We got Ruby and Leanne tag teaming the Ole Miss show going forward. So Leanne, good to see you as always.
Thanks, guys. Sorry I'm a little late to the party. Was talking Georgia football and a little, Ole Miss, a big game battle in the trenches, so y'all can fill me in. I know Ruby just made a great point about, Lane, the biggest win since he's been here. This is going to be a crucial game on so many fronts. Obviously, for us, it's a playoff berth. It's an opportunity to keep the dream alive. Going against Kirby Smarts, who undoubtedly is, blue collar, grit kind of guy, mentally always gets his guys in the game. So despite the struggles that we've seen, this late in the season, and you kind of alluded to it, despite all the problems we talked about with Carson Beck, kind of the difficulty, not having Brock Bowers, his go-to guy in that end zone, that comfortability. Kirby Smart and this Georgia Bulldog team always find a way offensively. And like I said, this is going to be a great challenge for Ole Miss. A lot of key components, and I think this is really going to be a game that's going to be won in the trenches, because you're talking about two defenses that are going head-to-head that have its own preakness of elite, but we also got put points on the board, and it's going to be a battle of two really good quarterbacks, and in the trenches with which offensive line can really help get a lead in aggression and keep both these quarterbacks clean in the pocket to be able to execute and put points on the board.
For sure. And I have a question from a Georgia perspective that I'm interested in. And I think, Leanne, you'll probably agree with this. Ole Miss has been looking, as soon as the schedule came out, has been looking at this Ole Miss Georgia game as this is our path to the playoff. And this has been a playoff game, just internally for what they need to do. The path to the playoffs runs through Georgia. Does Georgia feel that same way as well? Or were you more looking at the Alabama game? And this is kind of one of those games that you're supposed to win.
I would say it's not necessarily you're supposed to win this, because this is definitely one of the games I circled as a Georgia fan. But I think right now, Georgia, they're sitting at like the number one strength of schedule in the country, right? So I don't think you could circle one game. But yeah, I would say before the season started, it was definitely at Alabama and at Texas. So Ole Miss took the third seat there, but that's still a pretty high seat behind Alabama and Texas.
For sure. I'll take that as an Ole Miss fan.
One thing that was that Leanne brought up that I found that kind of led me to one of my points. What I find interesting about this game, this is probably the first Georgia game of the season where the opponent feels like the team under more pressure. Like with Kirby Smart teams, they're just kind of always the one under pressure. Like we had to live with the 1980 stuff for I don't know how long. You couldn't get excited about any season because then the rival fans talk about 1980. Like this right now, we went to that Alabama game with this is Alabama's Georgia's daddy, right? And Kalen DeBoer is the new coach. You can't let the new guy come in and beat you after Saban's dominated you for so long. And unfortunately they did. And the same with Texas. Texas was kind of the new kings of the SEC kind of being anointed. And Georgia was the one that kind of that was under the pressure to step up to that the table. So with Lane Kiffin and his reputation in big games versus top 25 versus top 10 teams, and like you said, with the two losses they already have, this is Ole Miss's season on the line on Saturday.
Oh, undoubtedly, and you brought up a really good point. I don't know if you guys touch on this. As far as what do you think the Georgia game plan is going to be here? Do you think they get aggressive early? Try to take some shots against the secondary. Where do you think that Kirby Smart? Because Kirby Smart is just meticulous in being able to break down a team. And he's one of the best coaches at adapting and adjusting. Ole Miss has adapted and adjusted, but against Kirby Smart and that coaching staff, that's going to be a real difficulty. So how do you think Georgia approaches this game to be able to control this game early? Because it's going to be a close one. Vegas has it 2.5, 2-point spread. So, this is a close one. So clearly they're giving credit where credit is due. But like I said, Kirby Smart comes in here and that staff, they played in big impact games where, like Ruby mentioned, Lane Kiffin's has not played in these kind of games with this kind of team. So what kind of approach do you think Georgia takes to be able to take control of this game earlier? How do you see Kirby Smart calls this game, and where are they going to, try to capitalize on Ole Miss strengths and weaknesses?
I think at the end of the day, it comes down to how this defense plays, because you've seen now, because I think that's Georgia's biggest advantage coming to this game is they are battle tested with going on the road at Alabama, going on the road at Texas. And you saw two very different games take place, and the difference was the defense. You saw Carson Beck throw 3 interceptions in both games. One of them you were down 28-0 at one point. The other one you basically dominated for 4 quarters. So Texas made it close, but I think with how just dominant Georgia's team was defensively in that performance, like that gave you a lot of confidence. But at the same time, that defensive performance versus Texas kind of feels like the outlier. So I don't think we've seen Georgia look like 2021, 2022 Georgia defense most of the season, except for that game versus Texas. But I think like we were kind of alluding to earlier, like Georgia wants to be able to run the ball. Like that's what Kirby Smart, that's where kind of he's, his philosophy, but they just haven't. Like the Texas game is probably the best they ran the ball this year, and ETN had a big game, and he left the Florida game, and I think is questionable, but I think he's likely to play, but he's dealing with a rib injury right now. So Georgia wants to run the ball, but I think they've kind of accepted the fact that the Carson Beck in this offense, like that's how they're going to be the most explosive. So we've seen Ole Miss's secondary at times give up some big plays. I think that's probably the way Georgia's still going to have to, live or die with Carson Beck.
One of the things that you brought up that's so important is, and I also a little bit of trauma as an Ole Miss fan, is it seems to be that these really good teams who have had problems, in this circumstance, Georgia's running game, they tend to figure it out against Ole Miss. And I'm hoping in this situation that isn't the case, but I think on Ole Miss's path to victory is going to be continuing to stop the run and containing Trevor Etienne, because if he gets going, and obviously the other offensive weapons that Georgia has, it's going to be a really long night for an otherwise really good Ole Miss defense that has played very well and has the players who can make the big plays, and especially with Carson Beck's interceptions this year. I think it's all really going to depend on Ole Miss's defensive line.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I think there's this narrative, I think, about Georgia that we kind of don't know what Georgia team we're getting week in and week out. I found it interesting, and I think a lot of it's based on Carson Beck, because the interceptions, like you can lose to anybody if your quarterback's throwing 3 interceptions, but Georgia's actually scored between 30 and 41 points 5 weeks in a row. They're actually the only team in the SEC that has 5 30-point games in conference play this year. No one else actually. I think Ole Miss only has one 30-point game in conference this year. So, and it was they doubled up. It was like 60 they just put on Arkansas, and that kind of makes Ole Miss's offense look a little better than I think it has in the first few weeks, because they have the number 1 scoring offense in the SEC when you just look at against SEC competition, but they were 11th coming into last week for that Arkansas game. So there's been as good as Lane Kiffin's offenses typically are, I'm not sure if this is which Ole Miss, if we're getting an elite offense, if we're getting the kind of the one that scored 17 points against Kentucky. I'm not sure that exact score off the top of my head.
13-12, right? Was it 13?
Oh, that was Georgia. Georgia did only score 13 against Kentucky.
I thought you were
that's
talking
fair.
about the Georgia game.
That was
17, something like that.
Yeah, I don't think anybody.
Yeah, 2017 was the Kentucky game.
Yeah, nobody expected Kentucky to play so well against us, or keep it close against so many teams. But again, defenses seem to be the storyline, and I think we've all kind of alluded to it, that it's going to be a game in the trenches. Like I said, these offensive lines are going head to head. Ole Miss offensive line hasn't done the best job, but they've done a lot better job, protecting and this time for Jackson Dart to be able to operate. But again, I think like we've all said, I think it's going to be a close one in a game in the trenches, no doubt.
If I could cut in real quick, what I find intriguing about these kind of matchups is you've got the established power. You've got the Alabama, Ohio State, and now Georgia's joined pretty much 2 or 3 programs in the country at that status. And then you've got Ole Miss. They're fun to watch. They got speed, athleticism. They got the quarterback, and they show glimpses of, and obviously their trajectory has been like this. Well, they matched up on a Saturday night last year, and I walked away from that game thinking, okay, I think Ole Miss has the skill position players. They got the speed. They got the quarterback. But man, just she got punched in the mouth over and over again. They could not stand up in the trenches, and that's where Georgia has separated themselves in the last 7 or 8 years, and it showed again in that game.
Absolutely. And Kiffin even left that game talking about we need to get bigger and better in the trenches. And that was a huge priority, I think, after getting, frankly, really embarrassed in what a game that was supposed to be good. And it was over by halftime. So I'm hoping that, I think on paper, Georgia still takes the edge off of roster, but I think Ole Miss now can compete, especially on the defensive front. Offensive line, as Leanne said, we've struggled a little bit, but getting better. I think Georgia's going to be the real test to see how much they can hold up. But yeah.
Ruby and Matt, we know you need to run. So Ruby, give us what an Ole Miss win looks like.
Okay. I think the biggest path to an Ole Miss victory is you got to score early. And Jackson needs to not force balls. And I think that Kiffin needs to be really smart to not throw deep balls into that Georgia secondary, because I don't think they're going to win using that tactic. But like we saw in Arkansas, those intermediate, middle range, like 10 to 19 yards. If Trey Harris is back, spreading the wealth to Caden Prescorn, Daquan Wright, Caden Lee, Jordan Watkins. If you continue to spread that out and get those middle range passes, I think that's going to be the path to victory for Ole Miss.
Ruby, great to have you here. You have a great rest of your day. We're going to see a lot of Ruby here on the Ole Miss Live show each and every week. Good
Thanks,
to see you,
guys.
Ruby.
Howdy,
Enjoy the
toddy.
game.
Meeting you, Ruby.
I'm Patty.
And real quick, Matt, before we let you go, in a sense, the same question, although with Georgia, it's kind of like just do what you do 99% of the time, I guess. But there has been, as you've addressed, those games where they've just kind of been dragged down by the opposition of Florida, Kentucky, and Mississippi State. So I'm sure that there is a lot of talk about what needs to be cleaned up for this team to reach its goals.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and a lot of it is going to come down to Carson Beck. Like, if your quarterback's throwing 3 interceptions, like I said, like, you can lose to just about anybody. The interesting part is that they're actually averaging more points per game in the games that he's thrown 3 interceptions. They're averaging 34 points per game in those, and 31 points per game in the rest of it. So go figure that. I can't make any sense of that. A lot is made of, like, the absence of Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey. But if you remember, Bowers missed 3-4 games last year. McConkey missed 4 or 5. So we saw this offense, work really well with those guys kind of missing a few games here or there due to injury. So I tend to think if Beck doesn't throw any interceptions and Georgia takes care of the ball, they can win this game, fairly easily. But if you're turning the ball over in a hostile environment, given the opponent's short fields, anything can happen. But I would say the fact that you've been able to survive the turnovers against a team like Texas, it's got to make you feel good about beating a team like Ole Miss, even if you are beating yourselves at times.
Matt, once again, it's great to have you here at the Voice of College Football, and everyone, you will see Matt over on the Georgia channel. So just stay tuned for dates and times and all that good stuff. But Matt, it's great to see you. And of course, we're looking for a great game on Saturday.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me.